welcome to Primetime Focus, Stepping into a Budding Industry. I'm Chelsea McDougall, and today I'm pleased to welcome Philip Harrison. Philip is an automation engineer and proud third-generation co-owner of Durapac, a prominent Michigan packaging and automation company founded in 1971. Philip grew up in a packaging and automation space and began writing packaging and automation software at the age of 12. He has a genuine passion for helping companies scale their packaging processes. Durapac is on the front line of the cannabis packaging industry. Durapac began designing and manufacturing cannabis packaging systems in 2015, and in 2018 began manufacturing cannabis pouches. Philip, welcome to Primetime, and thank you so much for being here today.
Thank you, Chelsea. Appreciate the opportunity.
Of course. Well, I know our audience is eager to hear from you, so let's just jump right in.
Great.
Let's start off with just telling me a little bit about your business and your involvement in the cannabis industry. How'd you get started, that sort of thing?
Yeah, so Durapac, we're a third generation family business. My grandfather started the place in the 70s. And so now it's my brother and I have taken over. And so our core competency has always been around scales and weights and measures. Back in the 70s, we kind of had a natural progression in automation and packaging, especially in the food industry. And our niche, even in food, has always been kind of like entrepreneur startups, like mid-level. And so we try to target verticals that, one, are just fun and exciting, which cannabis definitely, fills that. But two, it's a lot of startups, right, in cannabis because it's such a young, fresh, new industry. So we saw a lot of our core competencies and product lines and where we wanted to put our R&D efforts. We found that cannabis was a great vertical for us, so we kind of went all in.
And so you kind of touched on a little bit, but why did you decide to get involved with the cannabis industry? What was exciting about it?
We've been tracking the legalization movement for a while. It actually even started with my dad and all the different states in Colorado, and Michigan actually went where we are. Michigan went medical in 2008. And actually on the flexible packaging side of our business, we started selling, not child resistant because it didn't have to be medical back then, but we actually started selling pouches into the industry in 2008. And then the equipment side didn't really seem like a fit because volumes were so low for the medical guys, right? It wasn't until more and more states started going rec, and that's where the excitement really started to build. It started to branch out a lot more. There's a lot more volume and a lot more need for automation. And for us, when we find we can solve a problem on both fronts with the automation and the consumable, that's when we really get excited. So we saw a lot of voids in cannabis, a lot of people, unfortunately, rushing to the industry trying to make a quick buck, And so we kind of thought it would be good to have a company that's been around for 3 generations solving these problems instead of, just some startups. So.
Yeah. So, I guess that leads to my next question. Talk a little bit about the industry and the cannabis industry. I guess, what's the buyer profile like? A lot of startups. You said some people kind of maybe rushed into it. Talk a little bit about that.
Yeah, it's definitely a lot of startups. The feeling that I get, I almost compare it to like the .com era, right? It was like a boatload of startups, a ton of excitement, a lot of capital kind of rushing to the industry. Which is extremely fun and extremely exciting, but also leads to a lot of mistakes and maybe poor decision making. And that's where, when we got into the industry, we really tried to be part of the solution and not just try to cash in. So we spend a lot of time on the education piece. Unfortunately, I've toured a lot of cannabis plants, and you see, warehouses full of pouches and consumables that they can't use, or large investments in capital expenditures and equipment that they can't use, right? Because it was cool and it was shiny and they had a lot of money, and then they bought something and now they can't use it anymore. So there's an enormous amount of excitement, which is really fun. I love talking to cannabis clients. It's some of the funnest people to talk to. And over the years, we started to see it change where, they put the brakes on a little bit, still maintain the excitement, but do a little bit more research and kind of engineering on the front end.
Yeah. Now, in terms of products from Durapac, what are they sourcing from you guys?
Yep. So we've got kind of 2 sides of the business. We have the flexible packaging side. So we have what we call our Dura Defense line, which is a line of CR, child-resistant pouches. We have a stock product line of just, solid colors that they can label. But we can also do custom sizes and full print, either digital or, investing in plates for flexo for higher runs. And then on the equipment side, we have all the automation to automatically weigh and fill both, cannabis flower products and then pretty much every edible imaginable. We do a ton of gummies. That's a hot product. But then on the automation side, we can automate not only pouch filling, but we can do rigid container filling too, jars and tins and things like that as well.
Gotcha. So in terms of your printing processes, Durapac has gravure, flexo, and digital printing available. Of those, is there a printing process that's better suited to the cannabis industry, and why?
Great question. Digital. And even as they scale, so it used to just be a simple math problem, right? When you go from digital to investing in plates, flexo or roto. And one thing I advise everyone in the industry is stay digital a lot longer, even when the math says, you can amortize the plates and save money. And the biggest reason is the industry is so extremely volatile. So, all the states have their own regulations and those can change. And most states don't care that you're sitting on inventory, right? So they'll change a regulation and they don't care you got 6 months worth of pouches in the racks. And their marketing departments tend to always want to launch new SKUs too, right? And so, even if you're buying hundreds of thousands of pouches and you're like, I want to buy plates and go flexo, that plate investment and then the investment in inventory can come back to bite you. So even as people scale up to the point where investing in plates makes a lot of sense, I tend to advise staying digital a lot longer than you normally would in other industries.
Yeah, well, it makes sense with those changing regulations, and you and I have discussed this too. So let's move into that. How does Durapac and how do you stay ahead of those constant changes and deal with that?
Yeah, it's difficult again because every municipality is different. So a lot of staying up late reading websites, but also just in dialogue with the customers because we're on both ends of it. We're uniquely positioned when we're selling equipment. We're constantly getting fresh, updated information from our customer base too. And attending conferences and things like that. It's really difficult though. The people in this industry actually working with the plants and selling the products, they have a huge challenge ahead of them, to be honest, because everything changes. It can get kind of intense.
Yeah. Well, and I liked what you said. It doesn't matter if you have a whole warehouse full of pouches if they don't meet regulations. And Michigan kind of had an interesting story too, right? You said they didn't require child resistance, which that's kind of a universal requirement.
Yeah. Out of the gate, Michigan had a huge emphasis on more how the graphics looked than child resistant. And so you had to submit your graphics to Laura and get approved to make sure you weren't marketing toward children, which makes a ton of sense. Totally on board with that. But it was surprising. And a lot of states have done this where out of the gate, they don't require child resistance. And that's one thing I recommend to everybody is just go CR out of the gate. Again, it's the inventory thing, right? And so a lot of municipalities will require child resistant only for edibles and not for flower, which there is logic behind it because, a kid's going to want to eat a gummy or a candy bar, probably not so much, bite on a bud. But relative to the cost of the product and the package and the risk portfolio, our recommendation is whatever your municipality says, go way out in front of it and just start child resistance on pretty much everything. And then you're kind of future-proofing yourself. And then even from a branding marketing standpoint, I think it sends the message that you care, right? Like you don't want a kid to get into this stuff. You're not just trying to make, whatever that base minimum, what can I get away with? You actually do care. So that's my recommendation.
Yeah, that's great advice because it sounds to me like even if they don't start out doing child resistance like Michigan, it's a matter of time before they'll get there. So we get a lot of questions about child resistance, actually. So let's talk about that a little bit. What is it? How is it achieved? Is there kind of a governing body that oversees compliance of that?
Yeah. So first, thank you for your word choice because a lot of people say child-proof, which is actually a huge no-no. Nothing is child-proof. So everything is child-resistant. So there's a number of governing bodies here in the U.S. It's the Consumer Product Safety Commission. And so it's the CFR Part 1700. That's like the main that the testing lab certified here. But if you look at the entire scope, ASTM has their own standards. EPA actually has standards. You have the CSA in Canada with their standards, EN in Europe, and there's actually internationally, there's an ISO standard. I think it's 8317 that kind of covers it. So a lot of testing labs will actually test against all of these, and a lot of governing bodies, if you passed one, they're so similar, they'll kind of accept it. So the word child is in it, so everybody thinks child resistant, but in the actual testing, it's actually twofold. So the way the testing works is they take packages, they put them in a room full of children, roughly, I think, ages 4 or 5. And then pretty much they can't open the package over some period of time. Some really small percentage are allowed to open. But there's the other side of that, is that like adults and especially seniors have to be able to open it. And so there's 2 phases to the test. It's the kids can't get into it, and then you have to make sure the seniors can get into it. And so a lot of child resistant testing actually fails that part. So the kids can't get into it, great, but then, a senior can't open it, and then it ends up being a failure. So that's an often overlooked thing when people are designing child resistant packaging. Their heart's in the right spot, to making sure a kid can't get to it, but, then a poor senior can't, right? So it's kind of twofold. The other interesting thing too is there's different things depending on the child resistant closure that has to do with the size of the package. So just if somebody has like a child resistant closure, it's really worth it to make sure the actual whole package is certified. So if you're using a child resistant closure, but you're using a subpar film, they might not be able to get into the closure, but if they can tear through the film, right, it's not child resistant anymore. So a lot of people focus on the closure, but you really need to look at the whole package.
Yeah, that's great advice too. So speaking of films, Durapac is a valued customer of S1 labels and packaging. Can you talk a little bit about the products that you're sourcing from S1 LP for this market?
Yeah, for sure. So the biggest staple that we buy the most of is your 4 mil metallized structure. So we actually use a decent chunk of that plain as is. It has a very nice, shiny uniform finish. But then also for print applications, we'll use that as like an underlaminate, and then either put like your PET gloss overlam, or you've got some really nice matte finish options too, which is really popular in this industry. I think we probably do more matte finish in this industry than gloss. That's by far the premier one, but we also use the high barrier clear structures with EVOH in it. Those are better for like some of the bigger, more like grower bulk bags. It works well for that. And then we've been doing a lot of constant trials on the sustainable offerings, like a lot of the Green Arrow stuff, because it's high barrier. So we've actually made a lot of pouches and have some like recycle ready structures too, going through child resistant certification.
Great. And now, is there a reason you picked the 4 mil and those products?
Yeah, a lot of it is overall thickness and integrity of the pouch. Again, if you're going child resistance, you want as much material in there as possible. And then it's, perception too, right? If you get too thin of a pouch with a really high-end product, it kind of just feels chintzy, so to speak.
Great. And then, so you did touch on sustainability, and I'm glad that you brought that up. Is there a demand from the industry for more sustainable products like our Re-Earth, our Retrieve, our recyclable and bio-based films?
Huge demand, huge demand. I feel like I talk about it every day. So we've been working on this and doing trials for probably about 3 years now. It's relatively easy to do small, flat, single-serve pouches. The difficulty is when you start talking child resistant. Again, part of it's on the film side, and then the other part is attaching a large CR zipper to some of these green structures that by design either have to be easily recyclable or break down. It's very difficult to weld that in and get a good pouch out of it. So that's where we've been spending a lot of our time.
So Philip, a lot of S1LP's customers, the packaging manufacturers, are telling us that packaging is kind of an afterthought, and not just with cannabis brands, with a lot of brands, but when it's, as you know, arguably one of the most important aspects of launching a brand and getting your product on store shelves. But So tell me, when you're talking with cannabis clients and brands, when do you tell them to put packaging on the radar?
Yeah. And you kind of hit the nail on the head. We see it more in cannabis, but it's definitely not unique. Food and pretty much every company's, they've been doing this for years too, right? And so it tends to be an extreme afterthought. Selfishly, we think it should be at the very beginning. And it's twofold. You've got the consumable side, right? You got to make sure that you're picking the right pouch, you're sizing it correctly and everything else. But there's the automation piece that most people miss, that you really need to consider, 360 degrees, everything up front. And so what we see a lot of on both sides of the business is, they focus on the product and the marketing and everything else. And then it's like, oh crap, now we have to put it in something, right? Or they might spec the pouch and then they go to automate it and find out that they undersized their pouch. And oh, by the way, they already bought 1 million of them, right? And now they can't automate it. So we see this a lot. And again, it's why we try to get ourselves involved as early as possible, even in the early dialogue, because that's something that we offer. Like, we'll help size the pouch. We'll bring all these things up ahead of time, because even if you're launching a new product out of the gate, you're going to be hand filling it. Most people will, but you still have to think about what this looks like at different economies of scale. And so if you put a little bit of work on the front end, you don't have to rework anything, because it tends to be a snowball effect. Because if you get the pouch wrong, it's like, no big deal, you just resize it, right? And if you hopefully went digital print, you didn't lose an investment in plates. But the problem is that pouch probably went into some type of outer carton, which went into some case, which then goes on pallets, which then gets stretch wrapped, right? So when you make the pouch bigger, you have this huge snowball effect, and it can be extremely costly through the whole supply chain. So we recommend as soon as possible. We spend a lot of time on calls with customers that we know they're not going to be ready to order for a long time, but we appreciate the fact that we got to be involved up front just to kind of help walk them through this. So.
Yeah, it's almost as soon as that seed hits the soil, like call your packaging.
Exactly. Yeah. Call your packaging guy right away. Yes. Yeah.
So, Philip, are you seeing a lot of these cannabis brands using flexible packages with flour as well as with edibles? And how do they avoid crushing with the flour?
Yeah, good question. We see a lot of both. There tends to be almost like a product segregation where maybe like the more entry-level mainstream flour goes into pouches, and then the really, really high-end stuff goes into jars. And even from an automation standpoint, to be honest, you'll see a lot more automation in sort of the more entry-level mainstream flour products, especially if they're going into pouches. And you'll actually still see a decent amount of hand packing in jars. And then also, depending on where you are, COVID changes a lot, but a lot of dispensaries, it's more of a deli counter type experience where the packaging happens, while the customer's there anyways. So the jar is a really great fit for all the really high-end stuff because of what you said in terms of just protecting the product. It also looks a lot better in a lot of jars because of the glare. But the product degradation in pouches, as long as after the product is packaged, they do a good job of case packing it. It's almost like any fragile product. If you case pack it properly, it actually does stay extremely well protected. And then on the consumer side, a lot of people actually do prefer the pouch because it's easier to, slip into a purse or a pocket or something like that because it, conforms. So we see both.
Interesting. And then, so I guess just generally about the cannabis industry, what would you say is its biggest challenges or hurdles at this point?
I would probably say the constant change. The constant change and the lack of consistency across municipalities is big. And then you end up in a lot of states that maybe started medical and then went rec. You can actually have two different sets of rules operating in parallel, which is weird. And even in a single facility, they could do something for rec and for medical, and they have to follow two complete sets of guidelines. So I think just the constant changing is probably one of the biggest issues. And then banking and funding is a huge one, because everything's still at the state level, right? So that's a huge challenge for these people. Yeah.
So is it mostly a cash business, or how do you?
Yeah, there are some financial institutions that, we'll work with them. And it's interesting. when you go to conferences and people will say there are banks out there that will work with you. I just can't tell you who they are.
Yeah.
They don't want to advertise it. So there is a lot of, in fact, when we started doing medical and selling pouches, as a business, we're used to wire transfers and checks and things. And when we got into this business, we had to get accustomed to accepting a lot more cash payments. So there definitely is a lot of cash, but there are a lot of financial institutions that will work with them. And there's a lot of leasing companies now that aren't backed by traditional financial institutions that specifically will help with like CapEx for cannabis companies. And all they do is cannabis. So they understand it, right? And that's helped, at least from our vantage point, it's really helped a lot of these guys get off the ground.
So what would you say is the cannabis industry's kind of biggest opportunity?
I think it's that we're all just getting started. I mean, there's so much opportunity out there. It's insane. Every time I talk to people and I learn about the products that they're coming out with, it's just the coolest thing in the world. So you see kind of more innovation, I think, in cannabis than you do any other industry. What they're starting to infuse, CBDs and THC into is incredible. And even medicinally, what they're able to do now that a lot of the regulations are rolling back. I mean, there's a lot of people that, from cancer to chronic pain to all these different ailments that are finally getting help, just by visiting their local dispensary. And there's a lot of people on the product development side targeting this, which is exciting. So it kind of has a bad omen, right? A lot of people just think, oh, it's drugs, but it covers such a wide spectrum, unlike I think anything else, right? I mean, you can't really look at an industry that also, there's the rec and the fun side, but then, oh, by the way, they can help with all these different things too. So to me, that's the biggest excitement is all the product development and the huge umbrella that it covers.
Yeah, it's fun. Sounds fun to play in. And I guess my final question for you, Philip, is what advice would you have for other packaging companies that are looking at the cannabis industry?
I think the biggest one is to stay agile. And you pretty much have to go in expecting everything to change every single day. So a lot of companies, they like to, carve out a niche or do something and then rinse and repeat. And this is not a rinse and repeat industry. So culturally, organizationally, change and being agile pretty much has to be bred within your organization, I think, to go at this industry, at least in this phase. I mean, it's going to settle down eventually, but right now you pretty much have to be ready for change. And I think the other big thing is don't miss the education piece. There's a lot of industries you can get into, and you don't really have to be an expert on the product, right? So you can sell a pouch into a granola company or a machine to automate it, and you don't have to be a granola expert, right? But cannabis, if you don't have a lot of product knowledge going into it, you're going to struggle, right? Cannabis flower is an extremely unique product. You really have to understand all the properties, not only from the barrier and the flexible packaging side, but also from the material handling side, if you're going to automate it. So I think, stay agile and educate yourself as much as humanly possible.
Yeah. Well, thank you, Philip, so much. That was great. And the education piece that you mentioned, I think that's so important. And that's exactly why we're here today. So thank you for being an S1 LP customer, of course, one of our valued customers. And thank you for being here today on Primetime.
Thank you, Chelsea. I had a great time. Thank you so much.